views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have some show today, starting off with transportation alternatives. Should we make the city basically a city of bikers? Take away the cars. Interesting situation that we can imagine. Next up, guardianships, Article 81s, proceedings. Does someone you know or someone that you're friendly with maybe need a guardian over their person or property? We'll have an attorney on set to talk to you about that. And finally, is there virtue in finance? Good question. We have an author on who is going to give us his opinion. Stay with us. Today's verdict starts right now. Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have a returning guest. Unfortunately, the last time I saw him was in the studio. It's been a while, but Marco Conner DiAquoi. Am I getting that right, Marco?
Almost, Marco Conner DiAquoi.
I'm so close. I really worked on that. I really did. How you been?
I've been pretty well. Plenty of work to do, yes.
Listen, is it me or has the city become less safe when it comes to drivers?
It's a mix. So if we take the last 8 years of Mayor de Blasio's tenure, the first several years of that, where he basically adopted Vision Zero and made some significant improvements to our streets, although there was still too far in between, you did actually see significant improvements to safety. We saw overall fatality numbers go down in the first 5 years of Vision Zero. But in the last few years, specifically since 2019 and then last year during the pandemic, you've seen an increase in fatalities with more speeding as well.
You know, maybe it's me, only because I have a son now who's of the age where we're starting to decide whether it's okay for him to get off the bus and, and cross the street on his own. We haven't really made those decisions yet, but I look at the streets, especially near me, and the cars are constantly going through red lights. They're very, very, very fast. Bikes are going through. It's almost like, it's almost the Wild West. So anything we can do to make this city safer for pedestrians, or anyone else who's driving properly, I'm all for. But it looks like there's a new either initiative or a situation involving taking drivers at their word. Could you talk to the viewers about that?
Yes. So basically, that is a component. What you're referring to is a component of a program called the Dangerous Vehicle Abatement Program that comes out of legislation sponsored by City Council member Brad Lander. And pushed by street safety advocates and members of Families for Safe Streets who have been directly impacted by traffic violence, having lost someone or having been seriously injured themselves. And basically, the Dangerous Vehicle Abatement Program, what it will do once it is up and running, the city has not yet started it, is that it will create a course, a safe driving course that anyone who has racked up at least 15 speeding tickets from a camera or 5 red light camera tickets within 12 months, that they will be required to take that course. If they don't take that course, their vehicle will be subject to impoundment. And that's basically an effort to get at the worst of the worst drivers. For most people in New York City, when they get a speed camera ticket, they don't speed again within the following 3 years. But there's a small portion of drivers who continue to speed and rack up multiple tickets. And it is for this group of drivers, and there's several thousand of them nonetheless, where this program would apply. And what you're referring to is basically just how the city would evaluate the effectiveness of that program, where a component of that evaluation relies on self-reporting by drivers who have undergone that program training.
Well, as the deputy director for transportation alternatives, is there a particular feature, whether it's the lights in terms of speed lights or cameras or something that your organization says this was great, a home run, and we love it? And is there certain things that are just not working and have to be completely revamped? I got two questions in there. Which one do you want to handle first?
Well, I'm really just going to focus on what works, and we just need to see more of that. So there is no shortage of tools in our toolbox for the city of what works to make our city safe, to make it livable, so that you don't have to have that conversation with your son or the fear about him crossing the street. So just to take a step back, we have an epidemic of traffic violence in New York City. Last year, more than 243 people were killed. Nearly 3,000 people were seriously injured with lifelong debilitating and life-altering injuries. And since 2001, more than 6,000 people have been killed on our city streets. It's an epidemic of traffic violence. And we also are in a situation where most of our street space is taken up by cars, either storing cars for free. We have more than 3 million free parking spaces in the city, despite less than half of that number of registered vehicles in the city. And the majority of that space being spent on storing cars or driving. So 75% of our street space, our most prized public asset, beyond our population, our New Yorkers, our workers, is dedicated to storing or moving cars. And that means that everyone else is pushed to the margins of the streets, including you when you walk with your son or on a bike, for protected bike lanes, for the sidewalk space. Everyone else is pushed to the margins of the streets. And our city, our infrastructure has prioritized really the quick movement of as many cars as possible. And that comes at the cost of everyone else. It comes with the cost of increased fatalities. And so there are numerous tools that can be applied. We need to have more open streets in the city where car access is restricted. Protected bike lanes make it safer, not just for people biking, but also for people walking and for people driving. You need to narrow the width of many vehicle travel lanes. You need to implement turn restrictions at intersections with what's called neck downs.
There are delivery vans that need to get into the city, to make the deliveries to the supermarkets, to the clothing stores, the Amazon deliveries. That's not coming by bike. So, and a lot of people say that the restaurants have taken up a lot of the car space. Now everyone's double parking. What do you say to those who feel that at least the commercial vehicles are really being pushed to the limit? We are a city that needs goods delivered. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so it's really a failure of design and regulation. So it is not a true statement that those goods cannot be delivered by bike. The deliveries that we've seen an uptake in from Amazon with UPS, FedEx, and others, those are typically small parcel deliveries that can easily be delivered by cargo bike, by e-cargo bikes. And that's actually legislation by the City Council, by City Councilor Corey Johnson, to require the city to set up a system of small parcel deliveries using cargo bikes. So those deliveries that we see on our streets with these trucks, there is no need for them to be made in these large lethal trucks. Actually, they can be made with smaller vehicles, e-bikes, cargo bikes. Then coming into the city could easily set up some distribution centers so that you don't have these 53-foot trucks that are already illegal on city streets, but even large, smaller of 40 feet. There is no need to have them. So there are plenty of solutions at hand. It's just a matter of implementing them and having the political will really to do so.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. All good stuff. It's always good seeing you, Marco. Listen, I'd like you to come back maybe in the next couple of months, give us a little bit of update of what's going on, and hopefully our streets get safer and things move a little quicker.
Likewise. Thank you, David.
Sure. All right, stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We're going to be talking Britney Spears today, Britney Spears conservatorship. And we are pleased and honored to have with us Martha Cohen Stine, a family law and matrimonial attorney. Martha, thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me, David.
It's my pleasure. Listen, I'm fairly well versed with respect to the guardianship field. But we're talking conservatorship, so I guess right at the very onset, I'm going to ask you, is there a difference between a guardianship and a conservatorship?
Well, often the terms are interchangeable. In New York, we call it a guardianship. In other states, it's called a conservatorship. But generally, when we're discussing the Britney Spears case and the conservatorships in general, people do use the terms interchangeably. In New York, a guardian might be for a minor child. It also would be for an incompetent person.
So in New York, when we use the term, we're really talking guardianship. In California, they may be using the word conservatorship.
Yes,
correct?
but when we're talking about an incompetent adult, the terms are interchangeable. So I'm going to use the word conservatorship when we talk today.
So Martha, let's start from the beginning. You have somebody who seems to be incapacitated. Where does it start, and how would an action even be brought? Could you maybe walk the viewers through it a little bit if you could?
Okay, so often it's an elderly person who is suffering from dementia with increasing incapacity, who usually the person is a person of wealth, and the person is unable to care for himself or herself personally and or for his or her finances. Often the person is being taken advantage of by somebody financially, or is in very bad health and living in bad conditions, maybe not eating enough, not taking medication that the person should be taking. And often a concerned family member will consult with a lawyer and see, well, what can I do to help my elderly parent, elderly relative? And the lawyer may recommend to begin a conservatorship proceeding in court to have that person appointed conservator of the person and or property of the alleged incompetent individual.
So let's walk us through it. So now we have the action started, and we're seeking to have the appointment of a conservator. What's the next step? Does the judge just say, boom, you're a conservator, or
no.
Is there a process that goes
The
through?
process is that the petition gets filed. So that's the commencement of a legal proceeding where the judge presiding then appoints a court-appointed investigator to ascertain some of the facts and report back to the judge as to whether the ward is truly incompetent. In the opinion of the investigator, the court also appoints a lawyer for the alleged incompetent person. Sometimes the alleged incompetent person agrees voluntarily to the conservatorship, sometimes not.
Well, what happens if, certainly let's say with the Britney Spears type of conservatorship, where the parties don't seem to be agreeing as to who should be the conservator? I can understand if the kids get along and all of a sudden they want grandma's, everyone says, okay, you take care of grandma's person, I'll take care of grandma's property. What happens when you don't agree?
So what would happen is one sibling would file a petition to be appointed conservator. The other sibling who doesn't agree or doesn't trust the brother or sister files a cross petition. No, I should be appointed a conservator, or files papers in court as an interested party. No, my parent is not incompetent. My sibling is trying to take advantage of my parent. So that's the initial steps in the proceeding where the judge presiding has to make those initial determinations as to who is credible and what is really going on.
All right, so let's fast forward. Now we have an order, we have a conservator. What's the responsibility in terms of reporting to letting the rest of the world know, or somebody know, the steps that you've taken as the conservator?
Well, there are many, many rules governing the conservatorship in New York and all the other states as well. The powers granted to the conservator can be very broad, or they can be limited. So a person can be appointed conservator of just the person, which would mean you would have the responsibility for medical decisions and for helping the person care for himself or herself. Or you could be appointed the conservator of the person and the property, where you take over the ward's finances. Or one person is appointed conservator of the person and another person is appointed conservator of the property. As we see in Britney Spears's case, in the beginning, her father was appointed conservator of both the person and the property. As the time went on, he became the conservator of her property only, and somebody else was appointed conservator of her person.
Is this common? I mean, I know we see it in the news. There's a lot of money here when it comes to Britney Spears. Is this something that generally happens in New York, where the actions have to be reopened and looked at again, and possible new conservators or guardians appointed?
No, I think the Britney Spears case is very unique, and that's why it's gotten so much attention and public scrutiny, because typically the conservatee is an elderly person or an extremely disabled person whose disability is continuing and deteriorating. Here we had a young woman, Britney Spears, who had an episode of had a mental health issue and was in a crisis. And at that point in time, I think it was about 13 years ago, her family stepped in to try to help her. Her father stepped in. But as the years went by and she was better and she was healthier, I feel the proceeding was then became abusive.
All right, so somebody's watching today and they think they may have a particular issue with someone who's elderly, or just maybe not elderly, just someone who just can't seem to manage their own daily activities or finances. What advice would you give to someone looking, obviously, to contact you, but what advice would you give to somebody in terms of collecting data, whatever is needed? What would you tell them?
I would tell the person that it would be helpful to have medical reports about the alleged incapacitated person, whether it's from a neurologist or the person's family doctor, and affidavits from family members and neighbors describing the person's deterioration and the problems. So I would tell the potential client to get his or her ducks in a row, to have the information available about what the concern is and what the problems have been with the person. Now, conservatorships are designed to protect the alleged incapacitated person. They have a very noble purpose, and we do see situations where the conservatorships are fine and the person is being protected and it's a beneficial thing. The cases that get the publicity are the cases where there have been abuses.
And lastly, Martha, most importantly, where do we find you?
Where do we find me?
You.
I'm at 11 Times Square, New York City. At my firm is called Cohen Stine Kapoor, and we will take good care of you.
I like to hear. All right, Martha, hopefully you'll come back and we'll speak to you maybe in a couple of months.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Stay with us. Today's verdict has a lot more right after this. Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. I am extremely excited today to venture a little bit outside of the legal field as we move into finance. Author J.C. Swaan is here today. J.C., thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So, when it comes to fiduciary responsibility, it's maybe the only area that I really think we're definitely going to mix and match a little bit, finance and law. But what I really find fascinating, and I want you to tell the viewers a little bit about your book, is just the thought of virtue. I don't know if so much in the legal field, but virtue in finance. Where did you even decide to move into this type of arena and write this book?
Sure. Well, I studied economic development in grad school, and I was particularly interested in this concept of finance as a force for good, and finance as being really helpful to society. And at some point after grad school, I moved to the buy side. I became an investment professional, and I wanted to. Part of the reason I did this is I wanted to test it out, and the idea of investing in emerging markets in particular. That it could help the economic development of these countries. And I started working in a hedge fund that was focused on Asia. And it probably took me about a week to realize that I would have literally zero impact on the underlying economies. And that really spurred me to try to understand better in what ways finance is a force for good, under what circumstances. And so I started to teach, and I created a course on ethics in finance. That was really a way for me to understand this better.
Well, what I find, intriguing just from the very beginning of the book is you're not really focusing on the unethical behavior of individuals in finance, which we could do all the time. The Bernie Madoffs, we go right through them, but it's looking at the individuals that are doing good, that are actually promoting better for the society. Was that something you wanted to do from the very beginning?
Absolutely. And in fact, it really came from one of my students. When I started teaching about 12 years ago, this course on ethics and finance, halfway through my first semester teaching it, one of my students came to me and she said, why is it that when we talk about ethics and finance, we tend to focus on self-serving individuals, unethical behavior, and so on? And I thought about it and I thought, of course, why is it that we don't also focus on constructive behavior, inspiring people? And I started to look for that literature for my class. I couldn't find it. And so I made it a research project. And over the next several years, I tried to identify individuals that we could learn from.
But this particular quote from the book, which I enjoyed: financial firms such as JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs have a fiduciary responsibility of the client's interests, but not necessarily to make the world a better place. So it's almost like, they're working for their clients. Their clients want to make money so they can spend money any way they want. They're not working to make the world a better place. So where's the virtue?
So there's a nuance there, which is they have a professional mandate, which is to serve their customers' interests. And they needed to do that with their customers' interests in mind, even when no one is looking. And often, it's often the case in the industry that no one is looking. But my point here is that it's important for them to serve their customers' interests without extracting value from other stakeholders, and ideally by creating value for other stakeholders and for society. Now, the nuance is that we can't ask them to demonstrate that they're both creating value for their customers and creating social impact, which is what I meant here. And that's really the domain of impact investment funds and a specific niche in the finance industry. Now, stepping back, at the same time, I'm a strong believer in the view that finance is a force for good, that most of finance helps society, and to the extent that you serve your customers well without extracting value from other stakeholders and being mindful of the externalities, so the indirect consequences of what you do, then you will serve society.
Well, who in particular did you interview that really made a lasting impression on you? That's quoted in the book that you just would just say, what a wonderful human being.
Yeah, I mean, so I ended up writing about 60 individuals and firms. I would say probably the one that was most inspiring was Jack Bogle. And Jack Bogle, so he was the founder of Vanguard. And there's no one I can think of who's had more significant impact on society over the last several decades in finance than Bogle. And what he did was really, he was the pioneer, of course, for index investing, for passive index investments. And this idea that, there was a profound insight that we've known since the early 1970s that for most individual savers, you're much better off putting your money into an index fund than giving it to a mutual fund manager, to a hedge fund manager, because the reality is the vast majority of these active managers underperform the market because of the fees, right? And somehow it took 4 decades for the message to come across, and he's really the one who pushed it. And in a way that was, inside, like he could have made a lot more money. Like he created Vanguard by making it a not-for-profit as well. So that actually additionally reduced the fees. On top of the fact, if you invest in an index fund, like it's the fees are dramatically lower than if you invest in an actively managed fund.
All right, so let's fast forward. I'm going to take you 15 years from now. You're a little bit older, right? And you're writing another book. You're writing a sequel, right? Where do you see ourselves in 15 years? Are we more virtuous, less virtuous, or just about the same?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And there are a few thoughts here. And one of them is that so there's been an arc to the evolution of the finance industry. And in some ways, I would argue it's moving in a positive direction since the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis was a real milestone and a real point of soul searching for a lot of individuals in the industry. Since then, I can see in my students, the students who are interested in going to the finance industry, they are more kind of mindful of their role as citizens. And we have seen this in all sorts of ways also in the industry. And in the ESG revolution, this idea that we're going to embed environmental, social, and governance factors in investing. So I'm optimistic that 15 years from now, the industry will be in a better spot than it is today.
We try and leave the viewer sometimes with some tips or something that they can take away. Somebody's watching today. I know you're not an investment banker. You're not necessarily telling anybody where to invest. That's not your thing. But what would you tell them? Would you say, invest, these index funds are good places to maybe put your money because you're not paying the exorbitant fees? What would you say to a first-time person who's watching today? They're watching somewhere in the tri-state area or anywhere. What would you say to them?
I would, first of all, I wouldn't certainly not give any investment advice, but I would say the default for any individual saver should be that most of their savings should be in index funds in places like Vanguard. And then, there could be a small part of it that could be allocated to individual investments. But the reality is it's almost always the case that the market's going to do better than any specific investment that you're going to pick.
Well, JC, and we want to thank you very much. You're doing good in a field that there's not always such good. And virtue is a good thing. Hopefully you'll come back maybe in a couple of weeks, couple of months. Let us know your thoughts on where business is heading, if you could.
Great. Well, thanks so much, David.
It's our pleasure. All right, stay with us. Today's Verdict has so much more right after this. Well, that's all we have for today. I'd like to thank our 3 guests for joining us, and of course, you, the viewers, for watching. If you have a topic or an issue that you would like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, please email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. Until the next time, reach a verdict. See you in 2 weeks.